Sarah Mitchell was elbow-deep in packing boxes when her phone rang. The divorce papers had been finalized yesterday, and she had exactly 2 weeks to vacate the house she'd called home for 8 years. The caller ID showed a number she didn't recognize, with an area code from 3 states away. Ms. Mitchell, this is Calvin Reeves, estate attorney for Harold Mitchell. I'm afraid your uncle has passed away. Sarah nearly dropped the phone. Uncle Harold, the black sheep of the family, the eccentric recluse who'd once punched her father at a Christmas dinner 20 years ago and hadn't been invited back since. The uncle she'd secretly exchanged birthday cards with until she was 16. He left you his property, the entire estate, actually. The cabin sat on the edge of pristine Lake Windermere, a weathered but charming structure that looked like something from a storybook. It was surrounded by towering pines and had its own private dock extending into crystal-clear waters. The contrast between the natural beauty of her uncle's property and the meticulously manicured lawns of the adjacent Oak Ridge community couldn't have been more striking. Inside the cabin, Sarah found evidence of her uncle's rebellious spirit everywhere. Posted on the refrigerator was a collection of letters from the Oak Ridge Homeowners Association, each more strongly worded than the last, asking him to join. Each was annotated in Harold's distinctive scrawl. Pretentious nonsense. Fascists in polo shirts. Tell your landscaper to stay off my property. The most recent letter, dated just 2 months before his death, had a hand-drawn middle finger sketched in the margin. As Sarah explored the property, she met Ellie Henderson, an elderly woman from a neighboring cabin who brought over a blueberry pie and stories about Harold. Your uncle was the last holdout, Ellie explained, settling into a rocking chair on the porch. These properties were here decades before that fancy development. Harold had the paperwork framed, you know, the legal documents explicitly excluding this land from their jurisdiction. He'd wave it like a flag whenever that Reynolds man came sniffing around. Reynolds? Victor Reynolds, HOA president, former corporate attorney who failed upward his whole life, according to Harold. That man has wanted this lakefront property for years. Be careful of him, dear. Now that Harold's gone, he'll try something. He always does. Sarah spent the afternoon rummaging through her uncle's belongings, discovering a life she'd barely known. In his study, she found journals filled with observations of wildlife, sketches of the lake through changing seasons, and bitter commentaries on the encroaching development. One entry from 3 years earlier caught her eye. They cut down the old oak grove today to make room for more cookie-cutter Banksy mansions. 30 minutes of chainsaws and 300 years of history gone. Reynolds had the nerve to come by afterward, suggesting I'd be more comfortable if I joined their association. Told him I'd rather drink lake water during algae season. As night fell, Sarah sat on the dock, her feet dangling in the cool water. The lake mirrored the stars above, and across the water, the geometric patterns of Oak Ridge's streetlights formed an artificial constellation. The contrast was jarring. Nature versus control, organic versus planned. In the morning, Sarah ventured into town for groceries. At Windermere General Store, the cashier did a double take when she gave her name. Mitchell? Any relation to Harold? He was my uncle. I just inherited his place. The cashier, a weathered man with kind eyes, reached across the counter to shake her hand. Jim Holloway. Your uncle saved my business 15 years ago when a developer wanted to turn this whole stretch into condos. He organized the old-timers, found some environmental protection angle. Stubborn as hell, but the good kind of stubborn. Sounds like Uncle Harold, Sarah smiled. Jim glanced around, then lowered his voice. Listen, since you're taking over Harold's place, you should know. Reynolds and his HOA crew, they've been trying to consolidate the whole lakeshore for years. Your uncle was their biggest obstacle. With him gone, he trailed off meaningfully. What exactly should I watch for? Sarah asked. Anything. Accidental water shutoffs, noise complaints, health inspections. They'll manufacture problems, then offer solutions for a price. Usually membership in their HOA. On the drive back, Sarah noticed a black SUV parked near her access road. A man in a polo shirt making notes on a clipboard. He looked up as she passed, his gaze following her car with unsettling interest. Back at the cabin, Sarah found the framed document Ellie had mentioned, the legal exclusion certificate, dated 1978, explicitly stating that the original lakefront properties would never be subject to any future development associations. Beside it hung the faded photograph of a much younger Harold, arm in arm with a woman who looked remarkably like Sarah herself. She touched the glass gently. "Don't worry, Uncle Harold. I won't let them have it." Outside, across the peaceful lake, a meeting was beginning in the Oak Ridge Community Center. The agenda's first item: discussion of non-conforming properties, integration strategies. 8 months after inheriting the cabin, Sarah's freelance graphic design business was finally picking up. She'd created logos for 2 tech startups that had gone viral on social media, bringing in more clients than she could handle. The cabin had become her emergency fund, something to fall back on if work dried up, but otherwise a distant concern. On a particularly hectic Tuesday in March, Sarah received a strange text from Ellie Henderson. "Someone's been leaving papers on your door. 3rd time this month. Everything ok?" Sarah called the old woman immediately. "What kind of papers?" "Official looking. Envelopes with the Oak Ridge logo. Want me to open one?" "Please do." The silence on the other end of the line lasted too long. "Ellie, oh dear, it says you owe $6,800 in HOA dues and fines. There's talk of a lien, whatever that means." Sarah laughed. "That's ridiculous. Uncle Harold wasn't in their HOA, and neither am I." But unease settled in her stomach as she remembered Ellie's warning about Reynolds. What Sarah couldn't see was what was happening at that very moment, 3 states away. Victor Reynolds was sitting in the wood-paneled Oak Ridge community office, sliding a folder across the desk to his brother-in-law, James Harrington, CEO of Lakeview Developments. "The Mitchell property," Reynolds said with a thin smile. "The old man's niece hasn't responded to any notices, hasn't even been back since last fall." Harrington flipped through the paperwork. "You sure this will stick? The exclusionary clause is pretty clear." Reynolds tapped a document. "We had the city council rezone the lakefront last year. On paper, her property is now within our boundaries. She had 90 days to contest it. Time's up." "And the lien?" Reynolds' smile widened. "Filed this morning. Foreclosure proceedings begin in 30 days if unpaid. Given the lack of response to previous notices, I'd say we're looking at an auction by summer. Beyond that, we have righteous anger." One competed, eyes twinkling. "Sometimes that's enough." The next months became a blur of legal motions, research, and mounting bills. Sarah moved in with a friend to save on rent, worked 18-hour days on design projects, and spent every spare moment building their case. The breakthrough came unexpectedly. Sarah had created a website and social media campaign called HOA Hostile Takeover to document her fight. A former Oak Ridge administrative assistant saw it and made anonymous contact. "I have emails," the message read. "Reynolds and Harrington discussing your property months before the lien. They called it Operation Lakefront. There's more." Armed with these documents, Wong filed for an emergency injunction to halt demolition. The judge, a no-nonsense woman named Judge Claudia Rivera, granted it pending review. "Your Honor," Reynolds' attorney argued at the hearing, "the HOA followed all proper procedures." "Did they?" Judge Rivera countered. "Because these emails suggest the association president was conspiring to acquire Ms. Mitchell's property at a fraction of its value 6 months before any lien was filed. That doesn't sound like proper procedure to me." The courtroom fell silent. "Furthermore," the judge continued, "I find it curious that notices were only sent to a property everyone knew was vacant, when the county tax assessor had Ms. Mitchell's current address on file." When local news caught wind of the story, other victims emerged. An elderly couple who lost their home over a disputed fence height, a Navy veteran whose house was foreclosed while deployed overseas. A pattern formed, always with properties ending up in the hands of developers connected to Reynolds. The county prosecutor opened an investigation. Reynolds' carefully constructed reputation began crumbling. The final hearing took place on a bright autumn day, almost exactly 2 years after Sarah had inherited the cabin. The courtroom was packed with community members, reporters, and other HOA victims. Judge Rivera's ruling was decisively delivered. The court finds that the Oak Ridge HOA acted in bad faith, failed to provide proper notice, applied rules to property explicitly excluded from their jurisdiction, and engaged in what appears to be a coordinated scheme to acquire valuable property through improper means. She ordered the sale invalidated, the property returned to Sarah, and damages of $175,000 to cover legal fees, emotional distress, and punitive damages. Outside the courthouse, surrounded by supporters holding Stop HOA Abuse signs, Sarah faced a forest of microphones. "All I wanted was the cabin my uncle left me," she said, her voice steady. "What I got instead was an education in how easily our homes can be taken through abuse of power. Today isn't just a victory for me. It's for everyone who's ever felt powerless against an organization that was supposed to serve them, not prey upon them." 6 months later, a new cabin stood on Sarah's property, larger and more modern than her uncle's, but with many salvaged elements incorporated into the design. The porch railing was made from boards from Uncle Harold's dock. His old front door, with all its weather-beaten character, served as the entrance. On the anniversary of the court victory, Sarah hosted a gathering on her property. Ellie Henderson was there, as was Maxwell Wong, and many others who had supported her fight. Together, they formed the Homeowners Rights Collective, already helping dozens of people facing similar battles. As twilight fell over Lake Windermere, Sarah raised a glass on the porch her uncle had loved. "To Harold," she said, "who taught me that sometimes the most important thing you can do is stand your ground." From the wall inside, framed proudly behind glass, hung 2 documents side by side: her uncle's original property exclusion agreement and Judge Rivera's court order returning the property to its rightful owner. And if the cabin's bright teal paint job and wildflower garden happened to violate every aesthetic guideline in the Oak Ridge HOA handbook, well, that was purely coincidental. "And the expected sale price?" Harrington asked, eyes glinting. "Minimum bid of $25,000. A steal for lakefront property worth $500,000. What neither man knew was that as they spoke, Sarah was booking a flight. Something about Ellie's call had triggered her protective instincts. She needed to see these notices for herself. Sarah's rental car crunched on the gravel road leading to her cabin, kicking up dust in the late afternoon light. As she rounded the final bend, she slammed on the brakes. A large "No TRESPASFNG" sign had been erected at the entrance to her property. Behind it, her uncle's beloved cabin stood with plywood sheets nailed over the windows. Yellow caution tape crisscrossed the porch where she and Ellie had shared blueberry pie. Heart pounding, Sarah pulled forward, only to be intercepted by a white SUV with Oak Ridge security emblazoned on the side. A uniformed guard stepped out. "Ma'am, this is private property. You need to leave immediately." Sarah stepped out of her car, clutching her purse where she kept the deed. "This is my property. I'm Sarah Mitchell. I inherited it from my uncle." The guard's expression shifted subtly. "Mitchell, you'll need to speak with community administration. This property has been foreclosed upon." 20 minutes later, Sarah sat in a sterile office across from a woman whose nameplate read Diana Frost, Administrative Director. The walls were decorated with photos of smiling families enjoying Oak Ridge amenities. "Ms. Mitchell, according to our records, your property was sold at auction last week for $25,000 to cover outstanding debts to the association." Sarah's mouth went dry. "That's impossible. I never received any proper notice. And more importantly, my property isn't even part of your HOA." Frost slid several documents across the desk. "We sent multiple notices to the property address. As for jurisdiction, the municipal rezoning last year incorporated your lot into Oak Ridge boundaries." Sarah's hands trembled as she examined the papers. "This is criminal. I paid the property taxes. I updated my address with the county. You had ways to reach me. The responsibility to provide a current address falls on the homeowner," Frost replied mechanically, as if reading from a script. "Who bought it?" Sarah demanded. Lakeview Developments. They're scheduled to begin demolition Monday. Sarah stood so abruptly her chair tipped backward, crashing to the floor. This isn't over. As she stormed out of the office, she nearly collided with a tall man in an expensive suit. He steadied her with a hand on her arm. "Careful there," he said with a practiced smile. "Get your hands off me," Sarah snapped. "I'm Victor Reynolds, Oak Ridge HOA president. Is there a problem I can help with?" Sarah stepped back, taking in the man her uncle had despised. "You're the problem, Mr. Reynolds. And I'm going to be your worst nightmare." The law offices of Wong, Martinez, and Chen occupied a modest suite in downtown Portland. Sarah had chosen them not because they were the biggest firm, but because Maxwell Wong had written a scathing legal blog post titled HOA Overreach, America's Unchecked Tyranny. Wong wasn't what Sarah expected. Barely 5 feet tall, in his 60s, with thick glasses and a bounty, he looked more like a kindly librarian than a fierce attorney. But the moment he began speaking about her case, fire blazed behind those magnified eyes. "This stinks worse than week-old fish," he declared, scanning her documents. "Failure to properly notify, questionable jurisdiction claims, conflict of interest with the buyer, and the sale price. My God, it's practically theft." He looked up at Sarah. "This will be expensive. I don't want to mislead you. I have $15,000 in savings," Sarah said, "and good credit. Beyond that,